The global environment for dispute management is in a changing state. Currently, the ongoing process of change is being fashioned for COVID-19 times, while at the same time being geared to establish or expand upon more responsive infrastructure for dispute resolution. Hi there. Welcome to episode 9 of the Dispute Management in a New World podcast series, 40 minutes of bi-weekly conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm. It's brought to you by the JAIAC, protecting deposits for you and me. Caribbean Development Bank, reducing poverty and transforming lives through sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. Our conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm is a continuation of our discussion on technology, innovation, and the changing global environment for dispute management. I'm your host, Anieka Nelson. Thank you for joining us. Doc, last time we spoke, we covered a bit in terms of the change that is taking place globally as it relates to technology, as it relates to dispute management, and how that both are interacting with each other. Let's look a little bit now about how the change that is happening in technology can be viewed as a supporting block for dispute management.
I had mentioned earlier in the previous podcast episode that technology, when looked at, should not be considered simply by reference to gadgets and technical things as we know them,
right,
but in a much broader context. Now, if we're thinking about arbitration, litigation, and these things and how they function, clearly they all need some form of administrative support system for them to work properly. Now, in that context, let's take the court, for example, litigation services. For the court to function, it has its judges, it has its administrative machinery of registrars and clerks of the court and other persons who carry out their functions, all working together to support a system which will enable the person coming to court, a litigant, to get his or her matter dealt with, or its, as the case may be if it's a company, dealt with in the most expeditious manner possible, and where the parties can go away feeling that justice has been served. But that process is not simply about a judge. It's not simply about the persons who are registrars, clerks, masters of the court, and so on. It also is a system of ensuring that you have an adequate mechanism for entering claims when they're made, for keeping track of documents as they're filed, for ensuring that dates, something as critical as dates, that dates are properly recorded and notified, for ensuring that the system is there so things can bear the proper seals and stamp of the court and so on. And those things, you can have them being done purely manually, or you can have them being supported by technological advances in the nature of technical things. So, for example, a filing system can be all manual, but as we have progressed over time, we have seen where filing systems now rely on computer and internet systems. So persons are able to, and even with computer systems, there are instances where you have to physically turn up before somebody to be able to file a document. There are other systems which allow you to do that purely online.
Yes.
So you may not have any face-to-face dialogue. And there are some things that quite frankly are quite very efficiently done without the need for face-to-face dialogue. And that is one of the areas in which technology has actually assisted and supported that system. But as we go beyond that, the other thing to bear in mind as well is that if you have these systems in place for filing, there also is another element to the dispute management process, and that, for example, includes research and writing. Now, there is, of course, the old place that we call a library, which people typically think of in a very physical way, that you go in and you go through books and so on. But there's also a growing reliance on and support for online libraries, online resources. So more and more things are being taken in a digital format that allow you to view them without having to go through reams and reams of paper in an online format. And as I mentioned that, I remembered when I was a student at Queen Mary University, London, doing my LLM, I think it was at the time. And there was one particular professor whose area has to do with internet law, and another who is in the area of technology. And one asked the other, tell me, when last have you been to the library? Meaning the physical space, right? Mm-hmm. And the other said, oh, I think I did 2 weeks ago to have a word with the library. It was not about I went there to view the books or to look through the books.
Right.
Because both were making the point in that conversation that they are relying more and more on internet and electronic resources. So we have seen that been introduced. And what does it do? If you're able to, in your own time and in an easy to access and search method, get to what you want using electronic resources, what does it do? It speeds up the time of research.
Yes, it does.
So you're now able to get to material quicker. And as a result, you're then able to produce the results of your research faster. So there is a knock-on effect of not only making resources more available, but making it possible to deliver decisions in matters in a much faster way than you otherwise would have been able to. It is also easier to publish decisions and judgments and so on to the world. So I can, at a click of a mouse or something, be able to see what a decision was that was made in New Zealand or Australia or someplace recently, because a lot of these decisions and so on are being made available online. Mm-hmm. So it assists my research process, and it assists me as well in how I'm able to compare what is happening in my own jurisdiction with what is happening in other jurisdictions. So it has gone beyond simply enabling greater efficiency at the domestic level. Mm-hmm. It has allowed for us to have a real process of sharing our thoughts more and learning more through the intellectual propagation of others in other places, which has a significant comparative advantage and benefit, because it then means that we are able to go through the processes that we go through in a more enlightened way, enlightened not simply by ourselves but by others. And the enlightenment is critical, you know. Mm-hmm. And if you notice the top universities in the world, wherever you find them, they tend to have faculty from various countries.
Yes.
It is unlikely that you're going to go to any top university, for example, and you find only people from country A or from country B there. And why is this critical? Because again, it gets to the point where if you drink your own Kool-Aid enough, you have no idea what somebody else's Kool-Aid tastes like, or whether the other person's Kool-Aid is better than your own.
Yes.
So when you have a multiplicity of thought going on, in that context, you're likely to get to better results through contending views, not just by reference to what you say, but by reference to the socioeconomic, sociocultural, and other backgrounds that you take to the process. And it's the same thing here in the process of dispute management and decision-making. Much as we think we may have all the answers, we also know that there are other persons who are dealing with exactly the same issues day in, day out, in a different context. Mm-hmm. And it is sometimes worthwhile to learn from them, and we do, to ensure that we are able to enrich our own decision-making processes for the benefits of the persons who come to us.
Doc, I want to jump to artificial intelligence. It's fairly new, but it is now, mediation and dispute management is now in that space as well. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about that integration.
You have a number of algorithms and other things which are quite technical that have been developed to assist decision-making processes and to ensure that you're able to mimic as best as is possible the human mind and the human decision-making process. Mm-hmm. So that is what AI is simply about. Artificial intelligence is simply a process designed by men and women, human beings, where you set out to try to see how you can simplify processes and make them mimic what you expect to be the usual rationalization processes of human beings as best as is possible. Now, what you then do, since decision-making, which is what ultimately, when you go to a dispute management practitioner, you hope to come away with a decision. Either a decision that they enable or assist you to make yourself, or a decision which you empower them to make on your behalf. Now, in that situation, since decision-making is critical, if artificial intelligence can be engineered to make it easier for your standard form things to be decided, that is good in some ways. There's also the reality as well, that there's some matters which we take as human beings, we simply have difficulty deciding. I remember there are many judges, for example, who I've heard say, making a decision is the easy part. It's a sentencing that is difficult. How do you weigh all the factors and determine what is the appropriate sentence? So what has happened coming out of that? Courts across the globe have now developed what are appropriate sentencing guidelines that enable judges to look at guidelines as to where you should best consider an appropriate sentence in particular instances, depending on whether or not there are mitigating factors and all these things taken into consideration. But it doesn't change the fact, however, that even then, judges find it difficult not just to decide, but very often to sentence. Now, artificial intelligence can play a significant role there. But what is hoped for is that artificial intelligence can rid itself of some of the inherent biases that we have as human beings in making decisions. So the hoped for result is that you will have a situation where the machine, so to speak, takes a more dispassionate approach to the process of decision making. Unfortunately, as we've heard and as we should know, processes are designed by men and women by reference to what they know. So even these artificial intelligence processes, they themselves have built-in biases, implicit or otherwise. And so even then, much as it is supposed to be dispassionate, it may not always be as dispassionate as possible. Is there a loss for hope? No, I don't think so. Because the idea then is to consider how you can improve upon these systems to ensure that the biases that are inherent are whittled away as much as is possible, so you can get to something which is much more genuinely dispassionate and genuinely much more rational by reference to reason rather than reference to emotion. And I think that is critical and is a critical area, I think, that could be of assistance. But we have to be careful again, because decisions are never simply about rational thinking. They are live human beings, flesh and blood, and other factors around them that are critical. And it is sometimes important to bear in mind that a decision is never simply about dealing with A and B and whether or not the wood was 8 inches or 6 inches. It's a little more than that generally. It's about understanding the people before you, understanding the circumstances, some of which may be aggravating, some of which may be mitigating, and looking at the holistic framework to determine what is the appropriate standard to be applied, what is the appropriate approach to take to the decision, so that you give not just what we consider to be procedural, a decision which is of a procedural nature where you simply tick the boxes and go through with it, but something which is much more substantive in that it takes in things which are much more, not always written on a piece of paper, which you can sense, which you can detect as being appropriate and critical for the process of a decision to be made.
Doc, I get the sense that you are excited for artificial intelligence being incorporated more, but cautious. Is that correct?
I'm excited and cautious, that's true. And I would also advise myself, as I would anybody else, to be more attuned to developments as they happen, and to ensure wherever possible that we have a voice at the table in how these processes are developed, if we are able to at all. Because I think what is critical very often is that processes are sometimes developed where there is somebody in a dark room someplace, or in a very well-lit one, could be, making decisions by reference to what they think is a process of A plus B equals C, rather than by reference to a process which says A plus B equals C, however, there are these things. And I think it is us who are the end users, who are the beneficiaries of, who are the persons suffering the results of, who now need to introduce the howevers into the picture so that you can have better processes, be they of a technological nature or not, be they of a technical nature or not, being developed so that they can best serve us.
Now, are there ethical concerns surrounding the use of artificial intelligence in dispute management?
There are always ethical concerns, and the most significant one, I think, in my own view, is that the whole idea of decision making, if it is to be dispassionate, is that you're trying to avoid inherent or other biases creeping in. Now, if the process itself incorporates built-in biases, then the first ethical consideration is it being fair and just to all concerned?
Right.
Or does it have a bias which is naturally inclined to favor, naturally by design, inclined, and not designed because persons deliberately set out, but by reference to who designed it and what happened, to favor one party or another. So that is there. The other thing, of course, is to bear in mind that artificial intelligence, particularly where it involves things that are shared broadly, you run real risks of information seeping, leaking to others. Right? There's a very real risk there. And there are ethical considerations as to how you protect information in the online domain, as to how you protect information which comes about in these artificial intelligence programs. Because once things get caught up in one of these systems, the information never leaves.
True.
You may scrub as much as you think you can.
Yes.
But there's always a way and a method by which persons who know how to do it can trace the footprint and recover anything that is there.
Correct.
So there are ethical considerations now as to how you manage that. Ethical considerations as well regarding who should be managing it. Should it be government agencies? Should it be private sector agencies? Should it be a group of wealthy individuals? Should it be something which is more representative of the public as a whole?
Doc, what about the validity of the information that is out there as well?
There are ethical considerations about validity of information in a broad sense. I'm not just now sticking to artificial intelligence. I'm simply talking about information. Whether the information is on a page written, is on an on-site website page, or is in some other method, in some other way stored.
Right.
You can never get away from the fact that the information is sometimes valid, but sometimes invalid as well. And we cannot get around the fact that very often information is provided with agendas in mind. There are few of us, I tell you, it is true that however much we think we are, all neutral and everything else, there's none among us, whether you are a pope, a priest, a papa, a head of government, whatever you are, there's none among us who can claim that I am so neutral in everything about me, that you could never find a speck in me that shows that I do have some level of bias here or there. We all do. And the first thing we learn in that regard is that we must recognize that we have biases, inherently so, and then find ways to compensate for them in terms of how we deal with others and with situations that present. So the short answer then is that information that is out there is always laced with bias because of the source from which it comes.
Yes.
So the bias is not so much the lack of validity is not so much the information per se, but the information by reference to the source.
That's a good distinction. Thank you for that. What are some of the benefits that should be considered as it relates to the use of AI in dispute management?
Now, if we think about the benefits, I think I've already mentioned a few, including the capacity for greater speed,
right?
The capacity for dealing with, as well, greater volumes of information. What a simple telephone can do in terms of storage and capacity for retrieval of information, both of us sitting at the table would never be able to do in 100 years. Because these things are able to take information and store it in a way that you and I would never be able to do. So that is a significant value. So what we've found as well is that as societies become more complex, disputes by nature also become more complex. And as they become more complex, they're much more data-driven than they were before.
Yes.
And what is happening? Because again, you asked about information and validity earlier. Whether the information is valid or not, it is being produced. And if you're trying to get to a decision which honors the fairness principle, then you need to be exposed to the information that is available. And how you use it becomes critical. And you need to have, and the beauty about AI and other forms of machine technology and so on, is that you have a real opportunity to simply click a search term and it takes you to the relevant pages of so on of a publication. You wouldn't be able to do that in a human way, in the same way. So there are those questions that are no doubt helpful, and there are many others that could be cited. What, however, we need to bear in mind when we're going there in terms of disadvantages is to bear in mind, again, that one size does not fit all. And that a product developed in one jurisdiction, however valuable it is there, need not be the best for us because it would not have taken our circumstances in mind. So there is need, when you're looking at AI systems, to ensure that there's adaptability. Yes, things need to be transferable, but adaptability is a critical feature of any design that should be properly done. So that you can ensure that you look at populations, look at demographics generally, and then to see how it is that you can adapt the process to suit the circumstances and the specific needs that you're trying to deal with. It is also true that you can take something which is perfectly suited for one situation, but perfectly unsuited for something else. So it then means that, again, we have to spend a lot of time trying to understand the development. So one of the disadvantages, interestingly enough, is that some persons who are in decision-making capacities, including by reference to implementation of AI systems, some persons may not always, and many do, but some persons may not always devote the time and effort required to understand the systems prior to implementation.
Yes.
And the worst thing you could do is implement a product or service which has not been properly beta tested and determined to be satisfactory for the purposes that you need it.
Doc, the JAIAC hosted the Coffee Time series on this very topic, and I want us to get an idea of what one of the viewpoints shared was. So we're going to have a listen to it, and then when we come back, we will continue our discussion on it. Professor Iria Guifrida is our presenter.
In the legal profession, there is a certain degree of pride in not being technologically savvy. And this is not just in practice, but it is also in academia. And this is a problem because we simply cannot shut our mind to the kind of challenges that this kind of technologies are bringing. And the second aspect, so the second key point of our research was relating to the kind of work of specialism that we saw around. We saw a lot of lawyers specializing in one specific type of technology and legal implications of it, and not looking at how this sort of interplays in the real world. So here comes sort of the thesis of our work, which is that in fact we all living, and certainly over the last 12 months, we have experienced an acceleration of what we call the AI ecosystem, which is imagine it as a world that's sort of superimposed, as a cyber world that is superimposed in the physical world. Now, the two don't simply live as parallel to each other, but they interact, the physical and the cyber and vice versa. And I think that where I really want to, and where I encourage my students to pay a lot of attention, is the impact from the cyber to the physical. They're not, as I said, two separate universes, but they overlap. And sort of this slide sort of tries to summarize how they interact with each other. And the key component of this AI ecosystem and growing is data. And data is what I'm absolutely sure Jesse will be talking about when he introduces us to some of the challenges and the solutions that AI can provide in the world of e-discovery. But going back to sort of the more abstract world of sort of the work that I am doing, data ties in all these different kinds of technologies. The one that attracts the most attention and the one that I really want to talk to you about today is artificial intelligence. We're lawyers in the room, or at least most of us are lawyers, and we really want a definition. What is artificial intelligence? And this could take a really, really long time. I'm going to give you sort of a word of warning about artificial intelligence, especially in the commercial world. We're seeing solutions that are sophisticated being labeled as having artificial intelligence when probably they do not have artificial intelligence. I had to sort of try to give you a representation of what artificial intelligence looks like. I think that many of you imagine it a little bit like this, right? We have this extremely sophisticated artificial brain, and in some cases even manifested in a corporal element. But in fact, when I talk to my students, artificial intelligence looks a little bit more like this. And by this, I mean, it really is a kind of alien amongst us. And I had a discussion, or at least this conclusion has come up having spoken to a cybersecurity specialist, and in particular, he's a cryptographer. And we were trying to talk about artificial intelligence, and I'll move into the definition in a minute. But he said to me, essentially, from the scientific perspective, artificial intelligence is a kind of technology that it is so advanced that our current theories are not capable of explaining it, how it works.
Dr. Malcolm, any thoughts you want to add from that Coffee Time series that we just had a listen to?
Well, I'll say this much. Professor Gwifrida and I, she's a friend of mine, and we go way back to Queen Mary, University of London days. And I know that she has been one of the leading figures in the area of artificial intelligence and law. And her work centers around that. And I would hate to think there's anything. In fact, I'd put it another way. I simply know that her involvement in the field and what she's able to speak to from experience and from the research that she's doing far supersedes anything that I could think of. Because I simply don't have that interest in the area, nor that practical experience and insights that she would have. But having said so, it is instructive as we listen to her to hear her speak to the fact that not enough of us are in fact in tuned as we should be to AI and how it is developing.
Yes.
And I think the real danger coming out of that for me, going back to something I said earlier, is that we may be caught up in a wave. We flow with it simply because it is taking us in a direction, but without having given ourselves the opportunity to try to understand it and why it is that we should then make adjustments. But if we're not at the table, and if we're not appropriately equipped to make effective contributions to the discussion at the table, then we will go along with the tide.
Talk to us a little bit about how the JAIAC has been embracing the use of technology.
Well, the use of technology, the JAIAC is at the back end of the JAIAC, and everything we do is technology. We rely on computer systems. We rely on managing our processes, including, as I had indicated earlier, the recently launched iNeutral platform, which is intended to be and operates as an online dispute resolution platform. And that is technology driven. Have we gone to the furthest extent possible with the application of AI and so on? We haven't. Is that something that we are seriously considering and must consider? We all must. And we are no different than anybody else. It's something that we recognize is coming. It's something that is being expanded upon and being perfected as we go along. And it is important for us to keep abreast of developments and to ensure that we are ready, willing, and able to get into the game appropriately as and when the time is right. It's not necessarily right yet for us, but we will get there.
Of course, the JAIAC is not just operating regionally, you also operate within the wider international sphere.
It is. The JAIAC, though established in the Caribbean, with the Caribbean as a base, has never been shy about saying that it has been designed and developed to serve the entire globe. We understand that there are ways to get there and that you do not develop, grow, and become recognized globally overnight. But it certainly is an ambition that we have, and it certainly is something that we've always worked towards. And it is important as well that we understand that as we develop, we benchmark against the world and what is happening elsewhere.
Yes.
Because we want to ensure that the services that we offer and everything else that we do is at a standard that anybody from anywhere coming in contact with us would be happy about.
What makes online dispute resolution such a major pull in today's global sphere?
Well, for starters, there are many of us, just think about where we are now with a number of countries locked down and so on. And if we go back to the fact If you think of international transactions and recognize the cross-border nature of them, and you think as well back to the fact that all transactions, be they domestic or cross-border in nature, will have inherent conflicts that develop at one point or another.
Right.
Then you know that there is the need for resolving those disputes. Now, if you resolve them and you can't meet face-to-face because you're restricted from travel and all sorts of other things, then you get to a point where it becomes important to try to use other mechanisms, and online does that. And I'm going to cut away to something as in the court system. And we've heard that, for example, over time, arguments have been made as to whether Jamaica and other countries in the Caribbean should jettison the Privy Council and instead rely on our own regional or domestic courts, as we call them. And one of the arguments that has been made, and still is relevant even today, is the fact that many of our citizens are unable to travel to the place, the United Kingdom, where final decisions are made, simply because they require visas and may not have them. Now, if you think about that, but what has happened though, coming out of this pandemic, is that the Privy Council itself has also pivoted to online. So you can now have matters heard online, and matters are going on online, not just in the Privy Council, but in courts from across the world. Think about a simple situation, well, significant, but just use a simple example. Let's say person A being a man and person B being a woman have a child together. And person A believes that person B is about to kidnap that child. And I'm using kidnap in a broad way for the moment. To take that child to a country which is where she will not be able to have access to her child. What do you need in that time? You need a process that will enable you to stop that person leaving the airport or anything at all with your child. What do you need? An injunction from the court. Now, if it is that we are waiting on time and the courts are not functioning and people are then able to travel if they do, right? And the child is gone, what then do you do? And persons may say cynically, but you just said that countries are under lockdown, and I did. But the fact that countries were under lockdown and still are, does not mean that travel has not been happening. It still has been happening and has not stopped.
Right.
So the point I was making, which is a much broader point, is that notwithstanding the difficulties of a pandemic or other period, life goes on, problems continue, and we need to find effective solutions which are law-based very often. And to do that, there are instances, as we have seen now, where you simply cannot wait for the right physical time to happen. You have to find something which enables you to do otherwise, and online allows for that to happen.
Can we talk briefly about the policymakers in this sense? Do they have a role to play in how it is that we embrace technology and how it is that we use technology in dispute management?
The policymakers always have a role to play. Why? And when we're speaking of policymakers here, we're thinking of governmental authorities.
Yes.
That's what we're doing for the moment. Now, what happens in the context of our democracy? We have three arms of government: legislative, executive, judiciary. Now, policy comes through the executive, and that ultimately filters into what becomes the law. And the law ultimately is what guides all of us in our conduct. So the policymakers have a role to play in supporting and encouraging anything that will allow for speedier, better, and more efficient ways of providing access to justice. And at this time, AI and online processes are things that can help. And so while it is that you don't expect policymakers to simply jump head on and say we're implementing without significant thought, you expect that they will get to the table themselves, and they are being at the table, to ensure that they have dialogue and that they are sufficiently informed as to how best to support the use of technology in our courts, in our ADR systems, and otherwise in the best interest of the people.
What about technology companies?
We do need the persons who are on the technical side to be there to work collaboratively with the end users. You can develop programs, you can develop products and services, apps and so on, that are aligned with need and are not simply technically abstract. Because it happens very often, People develop some things which are so abstract that nobody wants to use it. So there is a need for a significant collaboration at all levels, bearing in mind that you're trying to serve discrete needs of real people having real problems.
In a real world. Finally, Doc, I noticed that you have something right there before you. It is JAIAC published material. Talk to us a little bit about your book.
Well, the Jamaica International Arbitration Center developed and has published its own rules for arbitration, mediation, and fast-track arbitration. And this publication, all the material that is in it is available on jaiac.org, but is also in a physical form. And what is critical about this is that the publication is not just about rules, it's rules and materials. And the materials, and I hasten to add this, includes a forward for one set of the rules from the Honorable Minister of Justice, Delroy Chuck in Jamaica, Justice Roy Anderson, and also from Maurice Stoppy, who really is the doyen of arbitration in our Caribbean region.
Yes.
And they have indicated their support for the rules that have been published. And we think that is critical because right there, what do we have? We have the minister who is a policymaker. We have a retired judge who, in fact, serves as a dispute management practitioner and so on, but he was speaking as well with his judicial background in mind, who is able to speak from a decision-making process stage. And we have the doyen, as I said, of arbitration in the region, Maurice Stoppy, who brings his wealth of experience to the table that he has developed. And we're talking about since the 50s, 1950s.
Wow.
And he's still around, still active, and still providing service and guidance. I benefit immensely from the guidance that he provides to me every single day. And I have never called him, and he does not make himself available.
The material in there, it speaks to arbitration, or does it speak to mediation? What exactly?
It speaks more. What it is really is a set of rules or guidelines that should be followed as to how you conduct these processes by reference to the JAIAC. We're always ready to take comments, questions, and persons can, in fact, comments can always be sent to info@jaiac.org. And as I said, as persons do that, we also invite them again to look to the website itself, jaiac.org. And for those persons who want to simply go to the online portal or platform, you can simply go to ineutral.jaiac.org, which is ineutral.jaiac.org.
Until next time, I'm Anieka Nelson on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, saying thank you for joining us. This program is produced with the kind sponsorship of the Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Caribbean Development Bank, reducing poverty and transforming lives through sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. Special thanks to ADEB Consultants Limited, consulting engineers practicing for over 40 years. Caribbean Development Bank, reducing poverty and transforming lives through sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. iNeutral, dispute resolution made easy. CP Malcolm, dispute management practitioner. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution Limited, CIADR. Mona Law Faculty, the University of the West Indies, Mona. Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean. All our podcast episodes are distributed by these platforms: Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.